Case of Jennie Brice by Mary Roberts Reinhardt. Read by Streaming Keys. I just have to say it that way every time. Then it becomes a thing. I'm going to put my glasses on just so this is easier. Quiet you. I looked at my clock as I went downstairs. It was just 12:30. I thought of telephoning Mr. Reynolds to meet me, but it was his lunch hour, and besides, I was afraid to telephone from the house, especially with Mr. Ladley still in it. Peter had been whining again. When I came down the stairs, he had stopped whimpering and wagged his tail. A strange boat had put into the hallway and was coming back. "Now, old boy," somebody was saying from the boat. "Steady, old chap, I've got something for you." A little man, elderly and alert, was standing up in the boat, pointing, poiling along with an oar, and Peter gave vents of joyful yelps. The elderly... The elderly gentleman brought his boat to a stop at the foot of the stairs and reached down into a tub at his feet, and he held a large piece of raw liver. Peter almost went crazy, and I remembered suddenly that I had forgotten to feed the poor beast in more than a day. "Would you like it?" the gentleman asked, and Peter sat up as he'd been taught to do and barked. The gentleman reached down again, got a wooden platter from a stack of them at his feet, and he placed the liver upon it and put it on the step. The whole thing was so neat and businesslike that I could only gaze. "Well, that's a well-trained dog, madam." "You should not have neglected him." "Well, the flood put him out of my mind," I explained humbly enough, but I was admittedly ashamed. Exactly. Do you know how many starving dogs and cats I found this morning?" And so he took a notebook out of his pocket and glanced at it. 48, madam. 93 cats. I have found them marooned in trees, clinging to fences, floating on barrels, and I have found them in comfortable houses where there was no excuse at all for their neglect. Well, I must be moving on. I have the report of a cat with a new litter in the loft of the stable near here. And he wiped his hands carefully on a fresh paper napkin, and on which also a heap rested on one of the seats of the boats, picked up an oar, and smiled wow, my tongue today. Smiling benevolently at Peter. And then suddenly he bent over and looked at the stained rope end tied to the stair rail. "What's that?" he said. "That's exactly what I'm going to find out," I replied, and I glanced up at the Ladleys' door, but it was closed. The little man dropped his oar and, fumbling in his pocket, pulled out a small magnifying glass, and he bent over, holding to the rail, and inspected the stain with the glass. I had taken a fancy to him at once. In spite of my excitement, I had to smile a little. "Oh, that's blood. Why did you cut the boat loose?" "I didn't. If that is blood, I want to know how it got here. That was a new rope last night." And I glanced at the Ladleys' door again, and he followed my eyes. "I wonder," he said, raising his voice a little, "if I might come into your kitchen, if you will allow me to fry a little of that liver. There's a wretched Maltese in the tree in the corner of 4th Street, and it won't touch it raw." I saw instantly that he wanted to talk to me, and so I turned around and led the way to the temporary kitchen that I had made. "Now," he said briskly when he had closed the door, "there's something wrong here. Perhaps if you tell me, I can help. If I can't, it will do you no good. It will do you good to talk about it either way." "My name is Holcomb, retired merchant. Apply to First National Bank for references." I smiled and said, "I'm not sure that anything is wrong. I guess I'm only nervous and thinking little things are big ones. There's probably nothing to tell." "Nonsense. I come down the street in my boat. A white-faced gentleman with cigarettes looks out from the window when I stop at the door and ducks back when I glance up. I come in and find a pet dog, obviously overfed ordinarily, whining in hunger on the stairs. As I prepare to feed him, a pale woman comes down, trying to put a right-hand glove on her left hand with a jacket wrong side out. What exactly am I to think?" And I started and looked at my coat. He was right. And when I tried to take it off, he helped me. He even patted me on the shoulder. What with his kindness and the long morning alone, worrying, and the sleepless night, I began to cry. And he had a clean handkerchief in my hand before I had time to think of one. "That's it. It'll do you good. Only don't make a noise about it. If it's a husband on the annual flood spree, don't worry, madam. They always come around in time to whitewash the cellars." "Oh, this isn't a husband," I sniffed. "Tell me about it." And there was something so kindly in his face, and it was so long since I had had a bit of human sympathy, that I almost broke down again. And I sat there with a crowd of children paddling on a raft outside the window, and Molly McGuire next door hauling the morning's milk up in a pail fastened to a rope, her doorway being too narrow to admit the milkman's boat. And I told him the whole story. "Well, it's curious, but you can't prove murder unless you can produce a body. When the river goes down, oh, we'll find the body," I said, shivering. "It's probably in the parlor." "Well, then why isn't he trying to get away?" "Well, he's ready to go now. He only went back in when your boat came." Mr. Holcomb ran to the door and, flinging it open, peered into the lower hall. But he was too late. The boat was gone. Tub of liver, pile of wooden platters, and all. We hurried up the room to the Ladleys, and it was empty. From the window as we looked out, we could see the boat almost a square away. It had stopped there, the street being higher. A doorstep there rose above the flood, and on the step was sitting a forlorn yellow puppy. As we stared, Mr. Ladley stopped the boat and looked back at us. He bent over and placed a piece of liver on the platter and reached it over to the dog, and then, rising in the boat, he bowed, his hat over his heart in our direction, sat down calmly, and rode out of sight. Mr. Holcomb was in a frenzy of rage. He jumped up and down, shaking his fist out the window after the retreating boat. He ran down the staircase only to come back and look out the window again. There wasn't a police boat in sight, but the McGuire children had worked their raft around the street and were under the window, so he leaned out and called after them. "A quarter each, boys, if you'll take me up to that raft at the nearest pavement." "All right, sir, but money first," said the oldest boy, holding out his cap. Mr. Holcomb didn't wait. He swung out over the windowsill, holding by his hands, and he landed fairly center in the raft. "Don't touch anything in that room till I come back," he said. Jerking the pole from one of the boys, he propelled the raft forward with amazing speed down the street. The liver on the stove was burning. There was the smell of it scorching through the rooms in a sort of bluish haze of smoke, and so I hurried back to take it off. By the time I had cleaned the pan, Mr. Holcomb was back again, and in his own boat, which he had found at the end of the next street, where the flood had ceased. But there was no sign of Ladley anywhere. He had also not seen a police boat. Well, perhaps it's just as well, he said philosophically. We can't go to the police with a wet slipper and a blood-stained rope and accuse a man of murder. We have to have a body. He killed her, I said obstinately. She told me yesterday he was a fiend. He killed her and he threw her body in the water. Yeah, very likely, but he didn't throw it here. In spite of that, he went all over the lower hall with the boat, filling every foot of the floor with an oar, just to make sure. Finally, he came back and looked at me as I stood on the stairs. There is something here, and I went cold all over. I had to clutch the railing. He dove in and brought it to the surface, only to find it was the dining room rug, which I had rolled up and forgotten to carry upstairs. At 1:30, Mr. Holcomb wrote a note and sent it off with Terry and borrowed my boots, which had been Mr. Pittman's, and he investigated the dining room and the kitchen from a floating plank. The doors were too narrow to admit the boat, but he found nothing more important there than a rolling pin. He was not at all depressed at his failure, though. He came back drenched to the skin about 3 and asked permission to search the Ladleys' bedroom. I have a friend coming pretty soon too, Mrs. Pittman, a young newspaper man named Hal. He's a nice boy, and if there's anything to this, I'd like him to have it for his paper. He and I have had some arguments about the merits of circumstantial evidence, and I know he'd like to work on this one. Well, I gave him a pair of Mr. Pittman's socks, for his own were saturated, and while I was changing, the telephone rang, and it was the theater again, asking for Jennie Brice. You're certain she's out of the city? Someone asked. It was the same voice from this morning. Well, her husband says so. Can you ask him to come to the phone? No, he's not here. When do you expect him back? I'm not sure he's coming back. Look here, can't you give me any satisfaction, or don't you care to? I've told you all I know. You don't know where she is? No, sir. She didn't say she was coming back to rehearse for next week's piece? No, her husband said she went away for a few days' rest. And he went away at about noon and hasn't come back. And that is all I know. Well, except that, and they owe me 3 weeks' rent that I'm likely to never get a hold of. Well, the owner of the voice hung up the receiver with a snap and left me pondering. It seemed to me that Mr. Ladley had been very reckless. Did he expect anyone to believe that Jennie Brice had really gone on a vacation without notifying the theater, especially when she was to rehearse that week? I thought it curious, to say the least. So I went back up and I told Mr. Holcomb, who put it down in his notebook, and together we went to the Ladleys' room. Well, the room was in better order than usual, as I have said. The bed was made, which was out of the ordinary, for Jennie Brice never made a bed. But this one was made the way a man makes one, with the blankets wrinkled and crooked beneath, and the white counterpane pulled smoothly over top, showing every hump beneath it. I showed Mr. Holcomb the splasher, dotted with ink as usual. "I'll take it off and soak it in milk. It's his fountain pen. When the ink doesn't run, he shakes it and... Wait a minute. Where's the clock?" Mr. Holcomb stopped in front of the mantel with a notebook in his hand. The clock. I turned and looked. My onyx clock was gone from the mantel shelf. Perhaps it seems strange, but from the moment I missed the clock, my rage at Mr. Ladley increased to a fury. It was all that I had left of my former gentility. When times were hard and I got behind in the rent, as happened now and again more than once, I've been tempted to sell the clock, or pawn it, but I've never done it. Its ticking kept me company on many a lonely night, and its elegance has helped me keep my pride, and to retain the respect of my neighbors. For in the flood district, onyx clocks are not exactly plentiful. Well, I used to have one. I stood staring at the mark in the dust on the mantel shelf, which Mr. Holcomb was now measuring with a pocket tape measure. "Are you sure you didn't take it away yourself?" "Sure? I could hardly lift it." He was looking carefully at the oblong of dust where the clock had stood. "The key's gone too," he said, busily making entries in his notebook. "What was the maker's name?" I don't think I ever noticed." He turned to me angrily. "Why didn't you notice? Good God, woman! Do you only use your eyes to cry with?" With apologies, this was written in 1910, and by a woman. But it doesn't exactly penetrate 100 years later on some notes. Sorry, back to the story. "How can you wind a clock time after time and not know the maker's name?" This just proves my contention. The average witness is unreliable. "Not at all. I'm ordinarily both accurate and observing." "Indeed," he said, putting his hands behind him. "Then perhaps you can tell me the color of pencil that I've been writing with." Certainly. Red." Most pencils are red. I thought this was safe. But he held his right hand out with a flourish. "I've been writing with a fountain pen," he said in deep disgust, and he turned back to me. But the next moment he had run the washstand and pulled it up from the wall. Behind it, where it had fallen, lay a towel. A towel covered with stains, as if someone had wiped bloody hands on it. He held it up, his face working with excitement, and I could only cover my eyes. "Well, this looks better," he said, and began to make a quick search of the room, running from one piece of furniture to another, pulling out the drawers, pulling out the bed, crawling along the baseboard with a lighted match in his hand, and he gave a shout of triumph finally and reappeared from behind the bed with the broken end of my knife in his hand. "Clumsy, very, very clumsy," he said. "Peter the dog could have done better." I had been examining the wallpaper about the washstand. Among the ink spots were one or two reddish ones that made me shiver. And seeing the scrap of notepaper stuck in the baseboard, I reached down and dug it out with a hairpin. I threw it into the grate to be burned later, and it was by the merest chance that there was no fire there, for the next moment Mr. Holcomb was on his knees by the fireplace reaching for the scrap. "Seriously, never, ever, ever do that under any such circumstances. You might throw away... Hello, How!" And I turned and saw a young man in the doorway smiling, his hat in his hand. "Well, hello." Even at first glance I liked Mr. Howe. And later, when everyone else was against him, and many other curious things were developing, I still stood by him through everything, and I even helped him to the thing he wanted more than anything else in the world. But we'll get to that later. "What's the trouble, Holcomb?" he said. "Hitting the trail again. Well, this is a very curious thing I just happened upon. Mrs. Pittman, this is Mr. Howell, of whom I spoke. Sit down, Howell, and let me read you something." With a crumpled paper still unopened in his hand, Mr. Holcomb took out his notebook and read aloud what we had written. I have it before me now. "Dog meat, $2, boats hire." That's not it. Here. Yesterday. Sunday, March 4th, Mrs. Pittman, landlady at 42 Union Street, heard her two boarders quarreling, man and wife. Man's name, Philip Ladley. Wife's name, Jennie Ladley, also known as Jennie Brice of the Liberty Stock Company, where she's been playing small parts. "Oh yeah, I've heard of her. Not much of an actress, I believe." Husband's also an actor, out of his work, and employing his leisure time in writing a play. "Everybody's doing it," said Mr. Howell idly. "Well, the Schuberts were to star him in his," I put in. "He said that the climax at the end of the second act," and Mr. Holcomb shut the book with a snap. "After we finished gossiping, I'll go on. Employing his leisure time writing a play," quoted Mr. Howell. "Exactly. Husband and wife not on good terms, quarreled frequently. On Sunday they fought all day, and Mrs. Ladley told Mrs. Pittman she was married to a fiend. At 4 o'clock Sunday afternoon, Ladley went out, returning at 5. Mrs. Pittman carried their supper to them at 6, and both ate heartily. She did not see Mrs. Ladley at the time, but heard her in the next room. They were apparently reconciled. Mrs. Pittman reported Mr. Ladley in high good humor. If quarrel recommenced during the night, the other boarder named Reynolds in the next room heard nothing. Mrs. Pittman was up and down until 1 o'clock, when she dozed off and heard no other unusual sound. Then approximately at 2 in the morning, this Reynolds comes down, said he had heard someone take the boat out of the lower hallway. He and Pittman investigated. The boat which Mrs. Pittman uses during the flood, which she had tied to the stairwell, was gone, having been cut loose, not untied. Everything else was quiet, except that Mrs. Ladley's dog had been shot into the third-story room. At 4:15 in the morning, Mrs. Pittman, thoroughly awake, heard the boat returning, and going to the stairs met Ladley coming in. He muttered something about having gone for medicine for his wife and went to his room, shutting the dog out. This is worth attention, for the dog ordinarily slept in their room. "But what sort of dog?" asked Mr. Howell. He had been listening attentively. "A water spaniel. The rest of the night or early morning was quiet. At 7:15, Ladley asked for coffee and toast for one, and on Mrs. Pittman remarking this, said that his wife was not playing this week and had gone out for a few days' vacation, having left early in the morning. Remember, during the night he had been out for medicine for her. Now she was able to travel, and in fact had already started." Mr. Howell was frowning at the floor. "Well, if he was doing anything wrong, he was doing it very badly," he said. "And so this is where I enter the case. I row into the lower hall this morning to feed the dog, Peter, who was whining on the staircase. Mrs. Pittman coming down, pale and agitated over the fact that the dog, shortly before, had found floating in the parlor downstairs a slipper belonging to Mrs. Ladley, and later a knife with a broken blade. She maintains that she had the knife last night upstairs, and that it was not broken, and that it must have been taken from the shelf in her room while she dozed. So the question is, why was the knife taken? Who took it and why? Has this man made away with his wife? Or has he not? Mr. Howell looked at me and smiled. You see, Holcomb and I are old enemies. Holcomb believes that circumstantial evidence will hang a man. I do not. So having found a wet slipper and a broken knife, you are prepared for murder and sudden death. I have more evidence, said Mr. Holcomb eagerly, and proceeded to tell what he had found in the room. Mr. Howell listened, smiling to himself, but at the mention of the onyx clock, he got up and went to the mantel. By Jove, he said, looking at the mark in the dust. Are you sure the clock was here yesterday? I wound it the night before last and put the key underneath. Yesterday, before they moved up, I wound it again. Well, the key's gone also. Well, what of it, Holcomb? Did he brain her with a clock or choke her with a key? Mr. Holcomb was looking at his notebook and did not take the bait. To summarize, we have here as clues indicating a crime, the rope, the broken knife, the slipper, the towel, and the clock. And this scrap of paper. We had almost forgotten about the scrap of paper, and he opened it in his hand and sat gazing. He looked at me and said, Is this Ladley's writing? And I knew it at once it was. I glanced at the slip Mr. Holcomb had just read from his... I glanced at the slip Mr. Holcomb had just read from his notebook. Rope, knife, slipper, towel, clock. And on the slip that we found behind the washstand said, rope, knife, shoe, towel, horn. The rest of the last word was torn off, but Mr. Howell was staring at the mantel. Clock, he repeated. Chapter 3 of The Case of Jennie Brice.